Imagine a quiet neighborhood where nothing seems out of the ordinary, until one family discovers their kind. Elderly neighbor isn't who she appears to be. Strange noises at night, shadowy figures in the window, and unexplained disappearances begin to unravel a horrifying truth. What would you do if the person you trusted the most turned out to be hiding something truly terrifying? Buckle up as we dive into a chilling tale of deception and the darkness that hides behind a smile. Let's begin with our first story. Welcome to the neighborhood, the realtor had said with a warm smile as the Johnson family unloaded their belongings into their charming new home. From the outside, it was a suburban dream. Quiet streets lined with trees, neighbors who waved at each other, and the soft hum of safety that came with small-town living. But beneath the surface of this picturesque scene lay a secret, one the Johnsons would soon uncover. Their neighbor, Mrs. Evelyn Carter, was the first to introduce herself. She was the embodiment of the perfect elderly neighbor. Kind eyes, a warm smile, and always a plate of freshly baked cookies in hand. "You'll love it here," she said softly, her voice carrying an almost musical quality. "If you ever need anything, don't hesitate to ask." Her presence was comforting, almost maternal, and the Johnsons quickly grew fond of her. But young Ben, the Johnsons' 8-year-old son, was less enthusiastic. The first time he met Mrs. Carter, he stood frozen behind his mother's leg, clutching her skirt tightly. When she crouched down to his level, offering a cookie with that same warm smile, he didn't reach out. Instead, he whispered, "She feels cold." His parents dismissed it as shyness. After all, moving was a big change. But over the next few weeks, Ben's unease around Mrs. Carter only grew. He avoided her, refusing to even look in her direction when she waved at him from her porch. One evening, as they sat down for dinner, Ben blurted out, "She's not real." The table fell silent. Mr. Johnson raised an eyebrow and asked, "What do you mean, Ben?" "She's as real as you and me." Ben shook his head vigorously, his eyes wide and frightened. "No, she's wearing someone else's skin." His parents exchanged a nervous laugh, brushing it off as the overactive imagination of a child who had been watching too many cartoons. But Ben wasn't laughing. That night, as the family settled into their routines, strange things began to happen. It started small. A photo frame in the living room tipped over without reason. The front door was found unlocked when Mr. Johnson swore he had bolted it, and their dog, Max, refused to go near the fence separating their yard from Mrs. Carter's. He'd bark furiously at the fence, the fur on his back standing up like needles, but no amount of coaxing could calm him down. Then there were the shadows. On several occasions, Mrs. Johnson swore she saw a figure moving behind the curtains of Mrs. Carter's house late at night. It was peculiar because Mrs. Carter always claimed to live alone. One particularly chilly evening, Mrs. Johnson decided to bring over a pie as a friendly gesture. Standing on Mrs. Carter's porch, she noticed faint voices coming from inside the house. She hesitated, listening. The voices were soft but unmistakably there, like a muffled conversation. When Mrs. Carter finally opened the door, the voices stopped. Her smile was as kind as ever, but her eyes, there was something off about them, something dark and knowing. "I'm sorry," Mrs. Johnson stammered, suddenly feeling foolish. "I thought I heard you talking to someone." Mrs. Carter tilted her head slightly, her smile never faltering. "Oh, I often talk to myself, dear. Old habits, you know." Mrs. Johnson nodded, handing over the pie, but as she turned to leave, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't the only one standing in that doorway. Things escalated the next morning when Ben refused to go to school. "She's watching me," he said, pointing to the window. His parents tried to reassure him, but when they looked, Mrs. Carter was indeed standing by her window, staring directly at their house. Her gaze didn't waver, even when Mr. Johnson waved awkwardly. "She's probably just curious," he muttered, but his words felt hollow. Later that evening, as they tucked Ben into bed, he clung to his mother, whispering, "Don't let her in. Promise me, Mom, don't let her in." "What do you mean, sweetheart?" Mrs. Johnson asked, stroking his hair. "She wants to come in," Ben said, his voice trembling. She wants to be in our house. In us. The room fell silent, the weight of his words chilling the air. The night after Ben's chilling warning, an unsettling stillness blanketed the Johnson household. The kind of silence that wasn't peaceful. It was oppressive, like the house itself was holding its breath. Mrs. Johnson couldn't sleep. Ben's words kept echoing in her mind. She wants to come in. She wants to be in us. Ridiculous, she told herself. Just a child's imagination running wild. But as she lay in bed, staring at the shadows dancing on the ceiling, she heard it. A soft, rhythmic tap on the window. Tap, tap, tap. She froze. The sound wasn't coming from her room but from Ben's. Heart pounding, she slipped out of bed, careful not to wake her husband, and tiptoed down the hall. The tapping continued, steady and deliberate. When she reached Ben's door, she paused, her hand trembling on the doorknob. "Ben," she called softly. No answer. Taking a deep breath, she pushed the door open. The room was dark except for the faint glow of the moonlight filtering through the curtains. Ben was sitting upright in his bed, staring at the window. His small frame was rigid, his hands clutching the blanket tightly around him. "Sweetheart, what's wrong?" Mrs. Johnson whispered, stepping inside. She followed his gaze to the window, where the curtains fluttered slightly in the breeze. But the window was closed. "She's outside," Ben said, his voice barely audible. "She's smiling at me." Mrs. Johnson felt her stomach twist. Slowly, she approached the window, her eyes scanning the yard below. Nothing, just the empty street and the swaying trees. She tried to sound reassuring. "There's no one there, Ben. You're safe." Ben finally turned to her, his eyes wide and brimming with tears. "She's not there now. She hides when you look." A cold shiver ran down her spine. She pulled Ben into her arms, whispering soothing words she didn't believe. As she tucked him back into bed, he grabbed her wrist tightly. "Don't let her in, Mom. Promise me." "I promise," she said, though her voice wavered. The next day, the strange occurrences intensified. Max, their loyal dog, disappeared. The Johnsons searched the entire neighborhood, calling his name, but there was no sign of him. Then, just as they were about to give up, Mr. Johnson found him cowering behind the shed, growling low and steady, his eyes fixed on Mrs. Carter's house. "I don't know what's gotten into him," Mr. Johnson said, pulling Max out by his collar. But Max wouldn't calm down. The closer they got to the house, the more frantic he became, until he broke free and bolted inside, barking furiously at the front door. That evening, while the family sat in the living room, the lights flickered. At first, it was just a brief surge, but then the room was plunged into complete darkness. "Probably just the fuse," Mr. Johnson muttered, grabbing a flashlight. But as he headed to the basement, Ben's voice cut through the dark. "She's here." Mrs. Johnson spun around, her heart racing. "What do you mean, Ben? What are you talking about?" "She's in the house," Ben whispered, his voice trembling. "She's inside." At that moment, a loud knock echoed through the house. Not from the front door, but from inside the walls. It was slow and deliberate, moving steadily from one side of the room to the other. Knock, knock, knock. Mr. Johnson reappeared, flashlight in hand. "What the hell was that?" he asked, his voice tinged with fear. The knocking stopped. For a moment, the house was eerily silent. Then, from upstairs, they heard the unmistakable creak of footsteps. "Is someone up there?" Mrs. Johnson whispered, clutching Ben tightly. "No one else is home," Mr. Johnson said, though he didn't sound convinced. He shone the flashlight toward the staircase, the beam slicing through the darkness. "Stay here," he said, starting up the steps. As the suspense builds, the Johnsons' once cozy home becomes a labyrinth of fear. What lies at the top of the stairs? Is the presence merely a figment of their imaginations? Or is Mrs. Carter's sinister influence growing stronger? Stay tuned for part 3, where the shadow lurking upstairs reveals its terrifying intent. The house was silent, eerily silent, but Claire couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking in the shadows, waiting. She stood at the doorway, staring into the dark hallway that seemed to stretch on forever. The storm outside raged, the thunder booming and shaking the walls, but inside, there was only that suffocating quiet. Her heart pounded in her chest as she stepped into the hallway. Every floorboard creaked under her weight, echoing like a warning through the emptiness. The walls felt like they were closing in, and she knew something was watching her. Something ancient, something evil. As Claire moved further into the house, she couldn't help but notice the cold, an unnatural chill that seemed to follow her every step. Her breath formed little clouds in the air as she reached the kitchen, where the door to the basement stood ajar. Claire's instincts screamed at her to turn back, but something she couldn't explain, drew her closer. She stepped down into the basement, the darkness swallowing her whole. As her foot landed on the last step, the door slammed shut behind her. Claire froze, her pulse racing. She tried to turn back, but the door was now locked, trapping her inside. A low whisper, barely audible, slithered into her ear, sending chills down her spine. The voice was familiar. It was the voice of someone she thought she could trust, someone who had disappeared a long time ago. "Claire," it whispered, soft yet menacing, like the brush of a cold wind against her skin. She spun around, her heart in her throat. But all she saw were the shadows, the creeping darkness that seemed to take on a life of its own. Claire had come to face the unknown, but she now realized just how deeply the evil had taken root. The house wasn't just haunted, it was alive. And it was hungry. What happens next is something you have to see to believe. You won't be able to look away. Don't forget to subscribe and click the bell icon so you don't miss what happens next. You won't want to miss the terrifying turn this story is about to take. The storm outside grew fiercer, its howling winds rattling the windows and shaking the very foundation of the Johnson family's home. Inside, the air was thick with tension. Claire stood frozen in place, her eyes locked on the dark corner of the living room where she had just seen the shadow. The strange events that had been escalating over the past few days had taken a terrifying turn. The house itself seemed to be alive, its walls closing in on them as if something wanted them trapped. Her heart pounded as she stepped forward, feeling the chill in the air become more oppressive with each step. Behind her, the sound of soft footsteps echoed in the hallway. "It's here," she whispered to herself, her breath catching in her throat. Suddenly, she felt a sharp tug at her sleeve, spinning around to find no one there. Only the sound of distant laughter echoed through the room. Just when Claire thought she could take no more, she heard it. A voice, soft and sinister, speaking her name from the darkness. It was the same voice that had plagued her dreams, only now it was real. Every instinct told her to run, but her legs were frozen, rooted to the spot. And then, in the blink of an eye, a shadowy figure materialized in front of her, its eyes glowing with an unholy intensity. Claire gasped, unable to tear her gaze away from the creature that had come for them. But just as quickly, the figure vanished, leaving nothing but the deafening silence behind. Claire knew, deep down, that this was far from over. The battle for her family's survival had only just begun. What would happen next? Will they escape the horror that's slowly creeping closer? You won't believe what happens next. If you're hooked, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on the notifications. You won't want to miss the chilling conclusion. The truth is darker than you think. The tension is unbearable as Dr. Callahan lays out the only way to stop the entity. Enter its very realm, face it head-on, and destroy it. It's not going to be easy, he says, looking at Rebecca and Ethan with solemn eyes. We have to enter its world and confront it directly. But there's no guarantee we'll make it back. The room feels colder as his words sink in. Rebecca, clutching Ethan tightly, wipes the tears from her eyes, her voice trembling but full of resolve. We'll do whatever it takes to save him. They head to the basement where an ancient summoning circle is prepared. The family steps closer to the circle, the ground beneath them growing colder by the second. With a few whispered words, Dr. Callahan begins chanting, summoning a portal. A swirling vortex of shadows opens before them, pulling them into the unknown. What awaits them on the other side? Suddenly, They find themselves standing in a twisted, nightmarish version of their own house. The walls are dripping black tar. The air is thick with whispers, the entity is near, and there it is, towering before them. The skeletal face twists into a grin. Its voice echoes like 1,000 screams. The boy belongs to me. His life fuels my existence. Ethan, shaking but determined, steps forward, gripping the bell Dr. Callahan gave him. You can't have me, Ethan says, ringing the bell in defiance. Rebecca joins him, holding the talisman high, the glow of light fighting back against the shadows. They speak in unison. Leave us. The wraith shrieks in agony, but it doesn't give up easily. It lunges. Then, the air is split with a blinding light as Dr. Callahan uses his relic to force the creature back. Will the family survive this final confrontation, or will they be trapped forever in the wraith's realm? The battle is fierce, but slowly, the wraith weakens, its form starting to disintegrate as the talisman's light grows brighter. Finally, with one last scream of rage, the entity is sucked into the void, vanishing completely. The family is thrown back into the basement, gasping for air, the oppressive darkness gone at last. It's over, Dr. Callahan whispers, exhausted but victorious. The family embraces, the relief overwhelming. But then, Ethan stops. He turns around, his eyes wide in fear. Mom, do you hear that? Rebecca feels a chill run down her spine. She turns to see Ethan staring into the darkness, the faint sound of a bell ringing in the distance. And that, my friends, is where we leave you for now. If you enjoyed this chilling tale, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more spine-tingling stories. Hit the bell icon to be notified when we post new videos. Thank you for watching, and remember, the night is never truly over